They fought a flawless war. Humans turned it into a problem. My name is Vexaloon, and I have spent 412 years watching civilizations destroy each other. Not in any cruel sense. It is simply my job. I am a senior conflict analyst for the Galactic Coalition's Conflict Resolution Bureau, and for most of those 4 centuries, my work was calm, predictable, and quietly satisfying. Wars followed patterns, commanders followed doctrine, civilizations rose, fought, negotiated, and settled into new borders with the sort of clean, orderly inevitability that made my data models sing. I had predicted the outcome of over 900 interstellar conflicts with an error margin of less than 3%. I was considered, without exaggeration, the finest conflict analyst in the known galaxy. Then the humans arrived, and inside 6 cycles they had reduced me to a creature who stared at blank data walls and questioned the foundations of his own discipline. But I am getting ahead of myself. The Velhari Dominion declared territorial expansion into the Outer Rim systems on the 14th day of the Coalition's 432nd standard year. The declaration was clean, formal, and utterly expected. The Velhari had been building toward this moment for 3 decades, and every analyst in my bureau had flagged it. When the expansion finally came, there was almost a sense of relief. The waiting was over. Now we could simply calculate the outcome. And the outcome, by every available measure, was not in doubt. The Velhari Dominion was not merely powerful, it was precise. Over 600 years of continuous military development had produced something that no other civilization in the Coalition's recorded history had managed to create. A war doctrine so refined, so mathematically optimized, that it had been studied and adopted in part by 11 separate civilizations. They called it the Cascade Protocol, and it was, without any exaggeration, the closest thing to a perfect system of organized conflict that the galaxy had ever produced. I had studied it myself, years before the Rim conflict began. It was genuinely beautiful, in the way that a bridge is beautiful, or a mathematical proof. Every component served every other component. The Velhari opened every campaign with a synchronized disruption of the enemy's communication grid, cutting commanders from their units before the first engagement. Then came economic pressure, applied with surgical precision to the points where a civilization's supply lines were thinnest. Then came the territorial maneuvers, not designed to destroy the enemy outright, but to systematically remove every position from which they could mount a recovery. By the time the enemy realized they had already lost. There was no dramatic final battle. There was only a quiet, mathematical certainty, and then a negotiated surrender that the Velhari always made generous enough to accept. 11 civilizations had faced the Cascade Protocol. 11 had surrendered within 50 standard cycles. The fastest collapse had taken 9. The slowest had taken 47, and that record was held by the Creeth Confederation, who had fought with particular stubbornness until their economic infrastructure gave out beneath them. The Outer Rim systems were not the Creeth Confederation. They were a loose collection of 14 inhabited planets and roughly 30 resource stations spread across a region of space that the Velhari wanted for its mineral deposits and navigational corridors. The Rim governments had modest fleets, moderate economies, and no unified military command. My models gave them 22 cycles before the first planetary government sent a surrender request. I was being generous. My official report to the Coalition Council was brief and confident. The Velhari expansion into the Outer Rim would succeed. The Rim systems would fall. The Coalition should prepare for post-conflict border negotiations and focus its diplomatic energy on ensuring the civilian populations of the Rim were protected under the standard transfer agreements. There was nothing unusual here. Nothing worth extraordinary concern. I filed the report and went to sleep. I was woken 4 cycles later by my junior assistant, a young Phaenid named Kor, who had the particular talent of delivering bad news with an expression of genuine personal apology. He stood at the entrance to my rest chamber looking exactly like that. "The Rim systems have contracted a defense force," he said. I told him that was expected. Several Rim governments had standing relationships with mercenary fleets. It would delay the outcome slightly. Kor handed me the data tablet without another word. I read it. Then I read it again. The defense force was not a mercenary fleet. The Outer Rim systems had reached out beyond the Coalition's established network of military contractors and placed a formal defense contract with a species registered under the Coalition's Emerging Civilization Index, a species so new to interstellar engagement that they did not yet have a seat on the Coalition Council. A species that had achieved faster-than-light travel only 211 years ago, and had spent most of those years arguing with each other about border disputes on their own worlds. The contract was with a species called humans, from a single world called Earth in a quiet corner of the galaxy's third quadrant. I sat up in my rest chamber and looked at Core. Humans, I said. Yes, senior analyst. The RIM systems hired humans. That is correct. I put the tablet down. I picked it up again. I looked at the contract value. The RIM systems had paid an enormous sum, which suggested they had done some research and believed they were getting something worthwhile. I could not imagine what had given them that impression. I went to my office immediately and pulled every piece of data the Coalition had on human military history. There was more than I expected. Humans had been fighting each other on their homeworld for essentially their entire recorded existence, and the records were extensive, chaotic, and deeply confusing. They had fought with metal blades, then with chemical projectile weapons, then with aerial craft, then with weapons capable of destroying cities in a single event, which they had apparently developed and then spent the next century terrified of using again. They had fought across every terrain type their world offered, in every climate, at every scale from individual skirmishes to conflicts that consumed entire continents and pulled in dozens of nations simultaneously. What I could not determine, no matter how long I studied those records, was any consistent doctrine. There were patterns, yes. There were examples of brilliant strategy and well-executed maneuvers, but there was no system, no protocol. Every major human conflict seemed to be fought differently from the last, adapting in real time to conditions in ways that my modeling frameworks struggled to categorize. One human general from their ancient period had apparently won a series of campaigns through sheer speed of movement, then failed entirely when the terrain changed. Another had pioneered a defensive strategy so stubborn that a superior force had simply exhausted itself attacking it. A third had lost nearly every engagement in a prolonged conflict and still eventually won the overall campaign because his side had proven more willing to endure the losses. I found this last example particularly unsettling. I spent 2 full cycles building a revised predictive model for the RIM conflict. My final assessment still favored the Velhari. The Cascade Protocol was simply too refined, too proven, too reliable. Humans were an unknown variable, but unknown variables in warfare almost always resolved in favor of the more experienced, better equipped, more strategically sophisticated force. I updated my prediction. The RIM systems would fall in 38 cycles instead of 22. I filed the report. I should have trusted my discomfort rather than my model. The Velhari opened their campaign with the standard first phase of the Cascade Protocol, and it went exactly as predicted. Their disruption units moved through the RIM's outer communication relays and burned them clean before a single government could coordinate a response. For approximately 4 cycles, the RIM systems were effectively blind, unable to talk to each other, unable to organize a united front, separated into isolated pockets that the Velhari could address one at a time. It was textbook. It was clean. It was everything the Cascade Protocol promised. Then the human fleet arrived. They did not arrive in a single organized formation. They arrived in groups, staggered across 4 separate entry vectors, which my initial analysis interpreted as poor coordination. I noted it in my log as a potential early indicator of organizational weakness. I was wrong, though I would not understand why for some time. The humans ignored the damaged communication relays entirely. They did not try to restore them, which any sensible defender would have done. Instead, their fleet distributed itself across the RIM's interior in a pattern that made no strategic sense by any doctrine I had ever studied. They were not reinforcing the strongest systems. They were not forming a defensive line. They were spreading out, thin and scattered, like a net thrown across open water. I leaned forward in my chair. I told Core to start a new data log. The Velhari proceeded to Phase 2 exactly on schedule, beginning their economic pressure campaign against the RIM's primary resource stations. This was the phase that had broken the Kreeth Confederation's will. Economic pressure was not dramatic, but it was relentless. and it was designed to make the cost of continued resistance feel heavier with every passing cycle. The humans appeared to be entirely unconcerned with the economic pressure campaign. Within 8 cycles of their arrival, they had established an informal supply network using decommissioned cargo vessels that the Velhari's targeting systems had initially classified as civilian non-combatants. The vessels were technically civilian. They were also carrying fuel cells, medical equipment, and replacement parts for the Rim's defensive platforms, moving through routes that the Velhari had not thought to monitor because no military doctrine considered those routes viable. I stared at the supply network data for a very long time. It was not efficient, it was not elegant, it was held together with what my research into human culture described as favors, personal relationships between individual captains who apparently trusted each other based on criteria I could not fully identify. One resupply run appeared to have been organized entirely because 2 human commanders had served together on a different ship 15 years earlier, and one of them had, according to the intercepted communication, owed the other one a favor since the Kepler incident. I did not know what the Kepler incident was. I was not sure I wanted to. What I did know was that the supply network was working. The Rim systems were not collapsing economically the way my models said they should. Somewhere in the chaotic web of human relationships and informal agreements, food and fuel and parts were reaching the places that needed them, and the people of the Rim were holding on. I called an emergency session with my bureau team. I told them my models needed revision. They asked by how much. I told them I was not certain yet. There was a long silence. Core, to his credit, simply opened a new data log and waited for me to continue. I revised my estimate. 50 cycles. The Rim systems would fall in 50 cycles. I was already behind the story, though I could not feel it yet. What I could feel, sitting in my office in the Coalition's Analysis Center, surrounded by data and projections, and the quiet hum of 400 years of expertise, was the first faint tremor of something I had not experienced in a very long time. I did not have a name for it immediately. I searched my memory and my files until I found the closest human equivalent. They called it unease. That quiet feeling when the numbers say one thing, and some deeper, older part of you says something else entirely. My numbers said the Velhari would win. Every data point supported it. The Cascade Protocol was functioning. The humans were outnumbered. Their supply network was improvised. Their command structure, as far as I could determine, barely existed. But something in the pattern of what I was watching felt different from every conflict I had ever analyzed. Something in the way the humans moved and communicated, and refused to behave according to any model I had built. I stayed at my desk long after my usual rest period, reading human history, and watching the live feeds from the Rim, and trying very hard to understand what it was that I was actually looking at. I did not sleep well that cycle. I would not sleep well for a long time. The war had been going for 12 cycles when I first intercepted a communication that genuinely stopped me cold. It came from a human commander named Owen Price, captain of a mid-sized defensive cruiser, stationed near the 3rd Rim relay point. His ship had been holding a position for 6 cycles that the Velhari had attempted to take 4 separate times. Each attempt had been repelled. Each repulsion had cost the humans significant damage. By any rational military calculation, Price should have withdrawn 2 cycles ago and consolidated his forces with the larger defensive grouping near Rim Central. He had not withdrawn, and in this intercepted communication to his crew, he explained why. He said that the relay point had been the last position held by a fighter wing that had been destroyed in the second Velhari push. He said those pilots had held it so that his ship could reach safety. He said they were not going to give it up. That was the entire strategic justification, not fleet positioning, not supply line logic, not a calculation of loss versus gain, because the people who had held it before them had died holding it. I put the communication down and looked at Core. Core looked back at me with the expression he usually reserved for when I asked him to revise a major report. "Is that normal?" I asked. "For humans?" Core had been doing his own research into human culture, partly out of professional necessity, and partly, I suspected, out of genuine fascination. He thought for a moment before he answered. "It appears to be," he said. "They have a word for it. Several words, actually. Loyalty, honor. They also have a concept called not letting people down, which seems to function as a motivational force of considerable power. I looked back at the communication. I looked at the engagement data for Price's position. The humans there had taken 40% losses. They were still holding. The Velhari, in 600 years of refined warfare, had never built a doctrine for opponents who held positions for emotional reasons. Why would they? Emotional reasons were not strategically valid. You could not model them. You could not predict them. You could not apply economic or territorial pressure to a crew that had decided they were holding, because it would dishonor the people who had died there. I opened a new file. I labeled it Human Variables. I began filling it in. Over the next 8 cycles, the file grew very large. There was the matter of how humans communicated in combat, which remained baffling. Their command structure was loose by any galactic military standard. Human captains made independent decisions constantly, sometimes in direct contradiction of the broader fleet directive, and somehow the overall strategy held together anyway. I spent considerable time trying to map their chain of command, before Core gently pointed out that I might be looking for something that did not quite exist in the form I expected. They adapt, he said. The commanders seem to trust each other to respond to what is actually happening, rather than to follow a fixed plan. That is not how militaries function, I told him. Core said nothing. We both looked at the engagement data, where human captains were doing exactly that. Their communications were also still a problem. Humans under pressure did not communicate in the clean, encoded, status report format that every other military species I had ever studied used. They used metaphors from their home world. They referenced events from their personal histories. A human commander telling her wing to hold position used a phrase from an old story about a narrow mountain pass from a civilization that had not existed for 2,000 years. Every pilot in her wing understood immediately. I had to spend 40 minutes in the cultural archive before I grasped the reference. How were they so fast? How did they share a context that deep, that quickly, under that much pressure? I could not find the answer in any structural analysis. The answer, I slowly came to understand, was that they had been building that shared context their entire lives, through stories and history and culture, and an endless accumulation of things they all knew together. The communication was fast, because the foundation beneath it was enormous. I added this to my human variables file, and stared at it for a long time. The Velhari noticed the humans were not collapsing on schedule, and made their first significant adaptation in Cycle 14. Executor Javel, the senior Velhari field commander, was a genuinely remarkable strategist. I had studied his previous campaigns and found them elegant, efficient, and utterly without waste. He had fought 18 engagements in his career, and won every one. He was not a creature who struggled with problems. He was struggling now. His adaptation in Cycle 14 was intelligent. Recognizing that the humans were using their scattered positioning to make the Cascade Protocol's sequential pressure difficult to apply, he consolidated his fleet and prepared to force a direct engagement at the Rim's most critical supply junction. A direct engagement played to Velhari's strengths: superior numbers, superior firepower, superior coordination. It also forced the humans to respond at a time and place of Javel's choosing. It was, by any standard doctrine, the correct move. The humans did not respond the way any doctrine predicted. They did not consolidate to meet the Velhari force. They did not retreat to preserve their strength. What they did was send 2 relatively small detachments to flank Javel's consolidated formation, while the main human force held at a completely different location, one that appeared to have no strategic value whatsoever, until Javel's fleet had committed to its position, and suddenly could not cover its supply lines without abandoning the engagement. I watched this unfold in real time, and felt something I had not felt in over 3 centuries of professional analysis. I was fascinated. Not pleased. Not relieved. The situation was deeply complicated, and my models were becoming increasingly unreliable. But I was watching something I had not seen before, and some very old part of my professional instinct was responding to it the way it had when I was a young analyst seeing my first genuine strategic surprise. Fascinated, despite everything. Javel pulled back from his consolidated position. It was the right call. The humans had not won that exchange outright, but they had forced a Velhari withdrawal without engaging the bulk of the Velhari fleet. I added this to my analysis, and then spent a considerable time staring at it. How had they known? Their intelligence-gathering capacity was smaller than the Velhari's. Their analytical resources were a fraction of what Javel had available. Their commanders were working with less information, less processing power, less institutional history. And yet, I pulled the communication records from the human commanders who had planned that flanking response. They had made the decision in 9 cycles, from initial observation of the Velhari consolidation to final fleet repositioning. 9 cycles. My bureau would have taken 25, minimum, to produce a strategic recommendation of that complexity. I found, buried in the communications, a conversation between 2 human captains during the planning phase. One of them, a woman named Clara Doyle, had suggested the flanking approach. The other, a man named Gordon Ash, had questioned it. The exchange lasted 7 minutes and was filled with the kind of informal language and rapid back and forth that I was beginning to recognize as the human version of a strategic session. At the end of it, Ash had said simply, "All right, let's try it. Let's try it." 600 years of Velhari military refinement, and these 2 people with their informal conversation and their willingness to simply try something had found the crack in it. I called my team together. I told them I was significantly revising my estimates. They asked by how much. I told them I no longer had a confident figure. This caused visible distress among my junior analysts, who had been raised, as I had been, to believe that confident figures were the entire point of our work. I understood their distress. I shared it. But I could not in good conscience give them a number I did not believe in. Core, as always, simply opened a new log. In Cycle 17, something happened that shifted the entire character of the conflict. A Velhari cruiser, during a rapid advance on a rim defensive station, destroyed a medical transport that had been moving through the engagement zone. The transport was clearly marked. It was operating under the Coalition's protected vessel protocols. The Velhari cruiser's commander made the decision to treat it as a supply vessel rather than a medical one. Whether this was a genuine misidentification or a deliberate choice, I could not determine from the available data. It did not matter. What mattered was what happened next. I had been tracking human motivation with increasing attention, and one of the things I had come to understand was that humans processed collective loss differently from any species I had previously studied. They did not simply note casualties as numbers in a damage assessment. They counted the specific individuals. They knew their names. They remembered what those individuals had meant to the people around them. There was a human concept called grief that functioned as both a deeply personal experience and, under certain conditions, a collective force. The destruction of the medical transport became that collective force. Within 3 cycles of the transport's loss, every engagement record I was monitoring showed a measurable shift in human combat behavior. Units that had been fighting to hold ground were now fighting to take it. Commanders who had been exercising careful restraint, pulling back when losses became too high, stopped pulling back. The calculation had changed. Something that had been a professional conflict had become, for the humans involved, something personal. Zavel noticed and made a critical error. He interpreted the emotional response as a tactical weakness, a sign that the humans were becoming less rational and therefore more predictable. He increased pressure on 2 fronts simultaneously, expecting the emotional reaction to lead to poor decisions. He was thinking about emotion the wrong way. I saw it before he did, because I had been studying the human variables longer. When humans became emotionally committed to a fight, they did not become sloppy. They became relentless. The poor decisions Javel was waiting for did not come. What came instead was a level of sustained effort, of endurance under pressure, of willingness to absorb losses and keep moving, that my models had no category for. Captain Owen Price, still holding that relay point, sent a communication to the rest of the human fleet that was intercepted and added to my file. I read it 17 times. It was not a strategic briefing. It was not a damage assessment. It was a short address to his crew, in which he named every person who had been on the medical transport and said they were going to make sure those names were worth something. By any analytical standard, this was not a militarily relevant communication. It changed no positions, corrected no tactics, transferred no resources. Within 24 hours of its broadcast, the human defensive line stabilized across every front simultaneously. I sat in my office with Core and the rest of my team and looked at the engagement data and tried to find a framework that explained what I was seeing. We tried 4 different modeling systems. None of them fit. Core finally said, very quietly, "Perhaps the framework is the problem." I looked at him. He was young and new to the work, and I had spent 400 years building the frameworks he was suggesting might be wrong. I did not dismiss him. I was beginning to suspect he was right. The human element could not be modeled with the tools I had. Not because the tools were primitive, but because the tools were built on an assumption that all military actors, when under sufficient pressure, would eventually perform a rational calculation and choose survival over resistance. It was a reasonable assumption. It had been correct for every species I had ever studied. Humans, under sufficient pressure, appeared to perform a different calculation entirely. They weighed what they were fighting for against what they stood to lose, and if the first number felt large enough, the second number stopped mattering in the way it should. This was not irrational. I forced myself to acknowledge that clearly. It was a different kind of rationality, one built not on individual survival probability, but on something harder to quantify, the value of the thing being defended. And humans, it turned out, were extraordinarily good at deciding that what they were defending was worth any cost. I wrote that sentence in my personal notes at the end of Cycle 18 and stared at it for a long time. Then I opened my official report file and began the most difficult revision of my 400-year career. Javel was not done. He was a remarkable strategist, and he had not survived 18 campaigns by failing to adapt. In Cycle 19, he pulled back to reassess, which was itself a significant act. The Cascade Protocol did not include a reassessment phase. The protocol was designed to move forward, always, applying pressure in a sequence that never gave the enemy time to recover. Pulling back gave the humans time to recover. I noted this in my analysis with a very small feeling of something that might have been, in a human, described as sympathy for an old and worthy opponent running out of answers. The war was no longer following any pattern I had ever recorded. Something new was happening in the Outer Rim, and I was watching it with the strange combination of professional alarm and genuine wonder that I had not felt since I was a student. I had spent 400 years knowing how wars ended. I no longer knew how this one would. Executor Javel spent 11 cycles in reassessment, and when he returned to the offensive, he was different. I noticed it immediately in the data. His movements were tighter, more conservative, less committed to the Cascade Protocol's sequential escalation. He was still brilliant, he was still dangerous, but he was no longer executing a plan he trusted completely. He was adapting in real time, and adaptation was not what the Velhari doctrine was built for. Their strength came from the certainty of the protocol. When the certainty cracked, something essential changed. His first move in the new offensive was aimed directly at the human fleet's command structure. Every previous analysis of the Cascade Protocol suggested this was a high-value target. Destroy the leadership, fragment the units, watch the coordination fail. It was how the Velhari had broken the Kreeth Confederation in the early cycles of that campaign, and it was logical, clean, and well executed. The human senior field commander, a woman named Laura Holt, was wounded in the 3rd day of Javel's renewed push. Her flagship took serious damage. She was evacuated to a medical station 3 systems away. I pulled up my projections. Every model I had built, even the revised ones that accounted for human emotional cohesion, predicted a measurable drop in human effectiveness following the loss of a central command figure. Leadership removal was a force multiplier for disruption. Every recorded military history supported this. I watched the engagement data for the next 6 cycles and slowly set my projections aside. The human units that had operated under Laura Holt did not falter. They did not become disorganized. If anything, the engagement data showed a slight increase in individual unit initiative, as if each captain and each crew had internalized their commander's approach well enough to carry it forward without her direct instruction. They were not waiting for new orders from above. They already knew what they were doing and why. I found an intercepted communication from a human captain named Daniel Shaw, who commanded one of Holt's former wing ships. He had received a request from the temporary command structure asking for his tactical assessment of the current situation and his recommendation for the next 72 hours. His response was confident and detailed, and showed a level of strategic awareness that should, by any standard, have required years of command experience he did not yet have. At the end of it, he added one sentence that stopped me entirely. He said, "She taught us what we were doing this for. That doesn't change just because she is not here." I read that sentence 4 times. Then I added it to my human variables file, which was now the largest single file in my entire analytical archive. What was happening in the Outer Rim was not a military campaign anymore, at least not in any sense I had been trained to analyze. It was something else. The humans were not fighting a war. They were sustaining one, day after day, cycle after cycle, through a combination of tactical improvisation, emotional commitment, and a collective identity so strong that removing any individual from it did not weaken the structure. They were not an army in the way I understood armies. They were more like a living system, capable of redistributing function when a part was damaged, healing around the wound rather than collapsing. Javel made 3 more significant attempts to force a decisive engagement over the next 20 cycles. I studied each one carefully. They were not the work of a defeated commander. They were the work of a great strategist, fighting at the edge of his framework, trying every tool his tradition had given him, and watching each one encounter something it was not designed for. The first attempt was a coordinated strike on the Rim's agricultural supply nodes. Cut the food supply, the logic ran, and you cut the will to continue. Populations under food stress became political pressure on their governments to negotiate. The Velhari had used this approach successfully twice before. The humans responded by reorganizing distribution from the inside out, prioritizing the most vulnerable populations first, and somehow managing to prevent the civilian suffering that should have generated political pressure to surrender. I found records of individual human ships making supply runs that had no formal military authorization, acting on personal initiative because the people doing it had decided it was the right thing to do. I wrote in my notes, "Human armies appear to contain significant numbers of individuals who make moral decisions independent of command structure, and somehow this does not cause chaos." Then I stared at that sentence for a while, because it should not have been true, and yet the data kept insisting it was. The second attempt by Javel was subtler and in some ways more revealing of how much he had been studying the humans himself. He began a targeted propaganda campaign aimed at fracturing the informal relationships between human commanders, sending fabricated communications, suggesting that certain captains had acted dishonorably in previous engagements, that others had been responsible for friendly casualties through negligence, that the human fleet leadership was concealing losses to maintain morale. For approximately 3 cycles, this appeared to be generating some tension. I could see it in the communication patterns, in the slight hesitations, and the increased verification requests between human units. Javel's intelligence team had clearly done their research and identified the human value system's pressure points: honor, trust, accountability, the particular pain that came from feeling betrayed by people you had depended on. Then something happened that I would not have predicted even with 1,000 cycles of analysis. The humans talked to each other, not through formal channels, not through command communications, through personal messages, informal contacts, the same web of relationships that had confused me from the beginning. Captain Gordon Ash reached out directly to the captain whose integrity had been questioned by the fabricated messages and said, plainly, that he did not believe it and wanted to know what had actually happened. The conversation that followed was entirely personal and lasted, by my records, approximately 3 hours. It ended with the 2 of them comparing the specific details of the fabricated accounts against their own recollections and identifying the inconsistencies. Within 2 cycles, every human unit in the fleet was aware that the communications had been fabricated, not because a central command issued a broadcast, because the humans had simply told each other, person to person, through every informal channel they had built over months of fighting together. Javel's propaganda campaign collapsed in the time it took the humans to have a series of honest conversations. I had a long discussion with Kor about this. They trust each other, he said, as if this explained it. Militaries require trust, I told him. All military organizations include trust as a structural component. Yes, Kor said, slowly, with the careful patience of someone explaining something to a person who is very smart and very close to understanding. But I think for them it is not structural. I think for them it is personal. I considered that for a long time. Structural trust was built into organizations. It came from ranks and protocols and the knowledge that the person next to you had passed the same tests and followed the same doctrine, and therefore would behave in predictable ways. Structural trust was efficient and scalable, and formed the backbone of every military I had ever studied. Personal trust was something different. It was slower to build and harder to break. It came from shared experience, from knowing not just that someone had passed a test, but knowing how they made decisions and what they valued, and what they were willing to do when the right answer was unclear. Personal trust was inefficient to build, difficult to manage at scale, and, apparently, nearly impossible to destroy from the outside. The Velhari had attacked the humans' structural trust. The humans didn't appear to have very much of it. What they had instead was personal trust, woven so deeply through their relationships that a propaganda campaign aimed at the structural level passed right through it without finding purchase. Javel's third attempt was a direct fleet engagement, the kind of clear, head-to-head confrontation that the Cascade Protocol had never actually required, because opponents had always surrendered before it became necessary. He was forcing it now, out of what I could only read as a form of professional desperation. If nothing else was working, perhaps sheer overwhelming force would break through whatever it was the humans were doing. The battle lasted 9 cycles, and ended without a decisive result. The Velhari applied superior firepower. The humans absorbed it, redistributed, and kept fighting. Individual ships took damage that should have forced withdrawal, and did not withdraw. Crews that should have reached their limit did not reach it, or reached it, and kept going. Javel's superior numbers gave him an advantage that the engagement data confirmed clearly. And yet at the end of 9 cycles, the Rim defensive line held. Not because the humans were stronger. They were not stronger. Not because they were better equipped. They were not better equipped. They held because they were willing to pay a price that Javel, operating within the elegant mathematics of the Cascade Protocol, had not built his model to account for. After the battle, I intercepted a private communication from Javel to Velhari High Command. It was the first time in the entire campaign that I had seen him write something that was not purely strategic. He wrote, "I do not know how to defeat an opponent who has decided that losing is not an option they are willing to accept. The Cascade Protocol assumes rational limits. These people do not appear to have the same limits." I read that message and felt something that I later identified, through careful research into human emotional vocabulary, as kinship. Not with Javel exactly, but with the experience of arriving at the edge of your framework and finding that the territory does not end where your map does. I had been there for 20 cycles now. It did not get more comfortable with familiarity. The war entered what I privately labeled its ungovernable phase. Neither side was winning in any clean, documentable sense. The Velhari held more territory in aggregate, but could not consolidate it without the humans finding ways to make consolidation expensive. The humans held their core defensive positions, but could not meaningfully push the Velhari back without resources they did not have. By every standard conflict resolution framework I had access to, both sides should have been actively seeking negotiation. The Velhari were. In Cycle 28, they opened a formal diplomatic channel and presented terms. The terms were, objectively, generous. The Velhari were willing to withdraw from 3 of the 14 Rim planets, guarantee civilian protection across the remaining occupied territories, and offer a trade agreement that would have made the Rim systems economically stronger than they had been before the conflict began. It was exactly the kind of offer that the Cascade Protocol was designed to eventually produce. Too good to refuse, mathematically speaking. The humans sat down to negotiate. I watched the negotiations for the next 11 cycles and began to understand something new about the species that I had been studying. They were not negotiating to reach agreement, or rather, agreement was not the only thing they were doing at the table. They were also, and I believe quite deliberately, negotiating to continue occupying Zavel's attention, to keep the diplomatic process active long enough to continue building their position in the field, and to introduce enough complexity into the discussions that any settlement would take longer to finalize than the Velhari's original timeline had allowed. Every time a major point neared resolution, a human diplomat named Arthur Pierce found something new to discuss. He was courteous, thorough, and apparently possessed of an entirely inexhaustible list of things that needed to be addressed before any agreement could be formalized. Item after item after item. I eventually counted 47 distinct clauses on the human side of the negotiating table at one point. Clause 31 was a formal apology. Clause 32 appeared, from the attached documentation, to be a recipe for something called a casserole, which was a type of food preparation from the human home world, included under the cultural exchange provisions of the proposed settlement framework. I showed this to Core. Core said, "I think they are buying time." "Obviously they are buying time," I said. "And also," Core said, very quietly, "I think they might genuinely want the apology." I looked at the clause. It was specific. It named the medical transport. It named the people who had been on it. It asked for a formal acknowledgement, in the text of the settlement agreement, that what had happened to them had been wrong. I thought about Owen Price and his relay point. I thought about Daniel Shaw and what he had said about Laura Holt. I thought about the way the entire human fleet had changed after the transport was destroyed, not because of numbers but because of names. The humans wanted the formal record to include those names. They wanted the official document of whatever came after this conflict to say, in language that could not be misread or overlooked, that those people had mattered, and that what had happened to them had been a wrong thing. I added this to my human variables file. Then I sat quietly for a moment and thought about what kind of species makes sure the names of its dead are written into the legal text of a peace agreement. The kind, I decided, that does not forget. The kind that carries its history in its chest, not in its archives. The kind that fights 11 cycles past the point where rational calculation says to stop, because somewhere in the middle of all that fighting, every person involved has become someone else's reason for continuing. I needed to revise my report to the Coalition Council. I needed to tell them that I had been wrong, and that the conflict in the Outer Rim was not going to resolve the way I had said it would, and that the species called humans had introduced something into the mathematics of interstellar conflict that I was not equipped to quantify with my existing tools. I needed to tell them that some things, apparently, could not be modeled. They could only be witnessed. I began writing the night before the cycle ended, and I did not stop until morning. The Velhari Dominion announced its withdrawal from the Outer Rim on the 63rd day of Cycle 41. They did not call it a defeat. Their official communique to the Galactic Coalition used the phrase strategic reorientation following an evaluation of resource allocation priorities, and it was written in the careful, formal language of an institution that had been giving polished official statements for 600 years. I read it 3 times. Between every line of that careful language, if you knew how to look, was the same thing Javel had written in his private message. "We do not know how to defeat this opponent." The Cascade Protocol was officially suspended indefinitely. Executor Javel filed for retirement 3 cycles after the withdrawal announcement. His career record remained technically unbroken. He had not lost. He had strategically reoriented. The Velhari Diplomatic Service understood the distinction and honored it in their official records. In his retirement communication, which was not classified and therefore reached my desk through normal channels, Javel wrote a single paragraph that I have read more times than I care to count. He wrote, "I was trained to fight wars. For 600 years, the Dominion's finest minds built a system that made war efficient, clean, and predictable. I believed in that system completely. I still believe it was a great achievement, but I learned something in the Outer Rim that the system never accounted for. There is a difference between an opponent who wants to win and an opponent who refuses to lose. I was prepared for the first. I had no preparation for the second." I added this to my file. Then I closed the file, walked to my window, and looked at the stars for a long time. The Outer Rim held a celebration that, by the data coming through my monitoring feeds, lasted approximately 9 days without stopping. The humans celebrated with a level of noise and food consumption and general disorder that seemed entirely disproportionate to a conflict that had, strictly speaking, ended in a stalemate rather than a clear victory. The Velhari had left. The Rim planets were still standing. That was, in objective terms, what had been achieved. The humans did not seem to be celebrating the objective terms. I received a formal invitation, through the Coalition's diplomatic office, to attend a reception held by the Rim Systems to honor the human defense forces. This was unusual. Analysts were not typically invited to celebrations. I asked my supervisor if I was expected to attend. My supervisor said it was at my discretion. I attended. The reception was held on a station orbiting the fourth rim planet, which had been one of the most heavily contested positions throughout the conflict. The station had been repaired since the fighting ended, but if you knew where to look, you could still see the places where the hull had been sealed over quickly with slightly different alloy, the scars of what had happened here. I arrived and stood near the edge of the large hall where the reception was taking place, watching the humans. They were loud. There is no diplomatic way to say it. They were warm and physical with each other in ways that I was not accustomed to, embracing and grabbing shoulders and producing sounds of laughter that seemed to come from somewhere very deep in them. Commanders who had been directing fleets were now standing in small groups, telling stories about specific moments in the conflict, interrupting each other to add details, competing gently over who remembered it most accurately. I recognized some of them from the communication records I had spent 40 cycles studying. There was Daniel Shaw, Laura Holt's former wing captain, talking to two people I did not immediately recognize. There was Arthur Pierce, the human diplomat who had produced 47 clauses, eating something that smelled strongly and appeared to please him very much. I looked for Gordon Ash and found him on the other side of the room, deep in conversation with Clara Doyle, the two captains who had planned the flanking maneuver that had first shown me the crack in the Cascade Protocol. A human approached me. She was young, with short dark hair, and she was carrying 2 containers of something. She introduced herself as Nina Cole, junior logistics officer for the Rim defense effort. She held out one of the containers. "You are the coalition analyst, right?" she said. "The one who was watching the whole thing?" I confirmed that I was. "We heard about you," she said. "Some of our commanders said you sent the most accurate running analysis of the campaign to the coalition, helped them understand what we were dealing with." She pushed the container toward me. "This is for you. It is called a drink. It is human. We made it ourselves because we ran out of the bottled kind 3 cycles ago." I looked at the container. I looked at her. She was smiling in the direct, uncomplicated way I had come to associate with humans who had decided they liked you. I took the container. I did not know why. My physiology was not designed for human beverages. But there was something in the gesture that seemed to require participation rather than analysis. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you," she said, "for paying attention." She moved back into the crowd, and I stood at the edge of the hall and looked around the room at all these people who had done what no model of mine had predicted they could do. I had been wrong about them, not in the details particularly. I had been right that they were outnumbered, right that their supply lines were improvised, right that their command structure was loose and their resources limited. All of those facts had been accurate. What I had been wrong about was what those facts meant. I had assumed they meant vulnerability. The humans had treated them as the normal condition of operating, something to be worked around, rather than a reason to stop. I had been wrong about something more fundamental as well. I had assumed that the purpose of fighting a war was to win it. The Velhari had assumed the same thing. 600 years of brilliant military development had been built on that assumption, and it had produced something genuinely extraordinary, a system so refined that it could reliably turn conflict into controlled, predictable, efficient outcomes. The humans had not been trying to win. Or rather, winning had not been the primary thing organizing their behavior. The primary thing, as far as I had been able to determine across 40 cycles of the most intensive study of my career, was something harder to name. It was the people next to them. It was the people who had been there before them and were gone now. It was the specific, named, irreplaceable individuals who had decided to stand somewhere and hold, and whom other specific, named, irreplaceable individuals had decided to honor by standing in the same place and holding a little longer. The Velhari had fought a war. It was a flawless war, technically speaking, efficient and clean and mathematically optimal. The humans had turned it into something the Cascade Protocol had no category for, not because they were stronger, or smarter, or better equipped, but because they had decided, each of them individually and all of them together, that the thing they were protecting was worth more than the cost of protecting it. You cannot build a model for that. I had tried. For 40 cycles, With every analytical tool I possessed, I had tried to turn that decision into a variable I could track and predict and account for. It was not a variable. It was a value, and values, I was learning very late in a very long career, worked differently from variables. Variables could be measured and projected and optimized against. Values were either held or they were not, and when they were held by enough people with enough conviction, they bent the shape of everything around them. I went back to my office the next morning and wrote my final report on the Outer Rim conflict. It was 3,014 pages long. My team read the summary and looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and quiet respect that I found, surprisingly, quite moving. The summary was 3 sentences. Humans cannot be war-gamed. They treat loss as information, not as conclusion. Do not fight them. Consider buying them dinner instead. My supervisor read the summary and asked if I was serious. I told her I was entirely serious, and that the dinner recommendation was the most practically useful piece of analysis in the document. She stared at me for a long moment. "You have changed," she said. I considered this. I was 412 years old. I had analyzed 943 conflicts. I had been wrong, in any significant way, fewer than 30 times. I had always recovered from being wrong by updating my models and returning to confidence in my methods. This time I had updated my models and discovered that the issue was not the models. The issue was what I had assumed models could contain. "I have learned something," I told her. "I am not sure it is something I will ever be able to fully put in a report." She asked me what it was. I thought about Owen Price holding a relay point because of the people who had held it before him. I thought about Daniel Shaw saying that what his commander had taught them did not stop being true just because she was gone. I thought about Nina Cole handing me a container of something and saying thank you for paying attention. I thought about 47 negotiating clauses and a formal apology, and a recipe for casserole written into the text of a potential peace agreement. Because somewhere in that document, there needed to be something that said those people had mattered. "I have learned," I said slowly, "that there is a kind of strength that does not appear in any weapon count or fleet assessment, or resource calculation. It does not register in communication analysis or command structure mapping. It is not a tactical variable, and it is not a strategic asset in any sense that I was trained to recognize." My supervisor waited. "It is the specific, irreplaceable weight of the people you are fighting for," I said. "When that weight is heavy enough, it changes what an opponent is willing to endure. And when an opponent is willing to endure more than you have planned for, no protocol in the galaxy is sufficient." I went back to my desk after that. I closed my official report file. I opened my personal notes and sat quietly for a long time. The Outer Rim was rebuilding. Laura Holt had returned from the medical station and, by the reports coming through, was already involved in the post-conflict reconstruction planning. Daniel Shaw had been promoted. Clara Doyle and Gordon Ash were apparently collaborating on a formal after-action analysis of the campaign that the coalition had quietly requested. Arthur Pierce had, I was told by someone in the diplomatic office, already found 11 things to discuss before the reconstruction framework could be finalized. Humans, I thought. What extraordinary, maddening, incomprehensible, instructive creatures. I did not file a prediction for what would come next, not because I was too tired, though 40 cycles of the most intensive analytical work of my career had left me genuinely exhausted, not because I lacked the data, though my confidence in what data could contain had been fundamentally revised. I did not file a prediction because for the first time in 400 years, I genuinely did not know what to predict. And I found, sitting in my office with the quiet hum of the station around me, and the memory of a reception and a container of something that had smelled nothing like what I was designed to consume, that not knowing felt different than it had before. It did not feel like failure. It felt like the beginning of something. I opened a new file. I labeled it simply, Humans. And I began, at the start of everything, to learn.